When I accepted the invitation to come and talk here, I thought, we'll have published our response to the public consultation by then, and it'll all be out in the open, all government proposals. And of course we haven't yet. And we're not today, so don't worry, I haven't got you all trapped in here today while we're publishing out there. We have a little way to go still to get through the political climate to be able to publish that. And I'll say a little bit about that as we go forward. So I think, is that going to do that? Yes. Okay, so what I propose to talk about today, something about progress with the directive and bring you up to date on where we are with that. I picked out some of the issues, and I was very much guided by the working groups that you've got here later on today, and thinking it would be helpful to say a few words about the topics that those groups are going to be covering. So I think I've got all of that there, and you're more than welcome, as Clive indicated, to ask me questions at the end, and I'll try my very best to be able to answer them. I feel like I'm living, eating and surviving on this directive at the moment, so hopefully I'll be able to help you with those questions. And I want to say a little bit at the end about the approach we've been taking on inspection over the last 12 to 18 months, and how that kind of relates to the approach we're taking overall about regulation, to sort of put that into some context, okay? And then time for questions at the end, I hope. So, new Animal Scientific Procedures Act has to be in place by 10th of November 2012 and to take effect from the 1st of January 2013. I think everybody knows that, but it's good to be reminded of that. Annex 3 standards for housing, care and accommodation, the housing standards need to be in place by January 2017, so there is a bit more breathing space on those. I just wanted to remind you of the government's guiding principles for EU legislation. I'm finding myself also needing to remind the government from time to time of what their guiding principles are for EU legislation, but there are three key ones which you've seen us talk about before, and we're using as the sort of fundamentals of how we need to implement this directive. So we need to ensure that UK, or endeavour to ensure that UK businesses are not put at a competitive disadvantage compared with their European counterparts. And in businesses there, I would include academia in our field, in the full breadth of what one might call business, because it's UK PLC and what leads to that success of UK PLC, I would say. We need to avoid over-implementation or gold plating. I'm not sure whether those two terms are actually synonymous, but they're actually driving in the same direction. And I think from conversations we've had over the many discussions that Clive referred to earlier, we have very much been looking at ways in which we can simplify the implementation without losing effectiveness, because that always seems to me to be the answer. You'll hear me time and again say, we do actually work in a very complex environment of science, and the tendency tends to be in complex environments for the regulator to be complex in return and to try and get more and more complex. And I think in a wide range of regulatory fields we're realising that actually isn't the right thing to do, because you just create more and more mouse traps or bear traps or whatever they are within the structure. So the answer is to try to be as simple as possible and yet retain effectiveness. And I think that's what we're trying to do as we go forward with the directive. And use copy out for transposition where it is available, where it's possible. The wording in the directive is worded as a directive, some of it's advisory terminology. And when I talk to Parliamentary Counsel, who's a lawyer, about how, well, can't we just take those words and put them into our act? And I'm sort of, a rather sad look goes over their face and saying, no, actually you can't do that. That's not appropriate text. So we're working on that to try and make sure, as far as possible, that the transposition does copy out the text, or at least the principles of what the directive is trying to say. And all of those principles are quite challenging. So where does that leave us? Where are we now? We need to publish the government response to the public consultation. That process is actively underway now, and the reason why I say underway is because you might think, well, isn't it easy, you just put it on the website and away you go. But one of the decisions we took when we went ahead with the consultation and the detail that was in it was that we realised that what came back to us, we needed to not only report back to you and say this is what you said and this is what they said and so on, but also to make sense of that, we needed to say, and therefore this is what we're proposing to do. And as soon as you get into therefore this is what we're proposing to do, you're now into government policy. This is government deciding how it's going to implement what its policy is going to be. And that therefore means you get into all of the palaver of getting cross-government agreement to be able to go public on what is basically a policy statement. So we want to do that, and in order to do that then, we had to take a view on what the impact of various measures that we were proposing would be, which meant that basically the public consultation response has got all of that in it. We want to publish it with a sufficient window of time to be able to get back feedback. It won't be a big window, it'll probably be, we're hoping to be about 6 to 8 weeks. So we're planning a series of meetings with stakeholders during that interval, because we need to move forward and move what are currently draft regulations into becoming regulations that we lay before Parliament. So this is the other piece of work that needs to be done. So whilst you've been thinking it's taking the Home Office an awful long time to publish a response to the public consultation, we actually have been doing a lot of work behind that underpins it. So we need to complete drafting the regulations, and we are well on the way to that. And those regulations will reflect the policy that we're proposing in the response to the public consultation. As I've already said, we've got to do the impact assessment. Normally this would happen after publishing a response to consultation. We had to do it beforehand so that we knew what the impact was, or we were able to put forward what we thought the impact was. And that's got to be cleared through the Home Office economists and through the Regulatory Policy Committee. So that is all underway now as well, and we've got that happening. We will, once we get all of that agreed, need to then take the draft regulations to the Home Affairs Committee and the Reducing Regulations Committees. Don't worry about remembering all of these. I have to remember them, you don't have to remember them all. But what this means is we're moving through, and there are various other steps within there that I haven't bothered to bore you with on this slide, but there are various steps which will allow us to table the regulations in Parliament. And we want to try and do that before summer recess, which is early this year, so that doesn't help us. It's 17th of July, so we need to get all of this done, and that dictates this 2-month window I talked about. In the midst of all of this, we're preparing a draft guidance, and of course the guidance depends on what the regulations are going to say, so everything has its interdependencies. We're also working on a further version of the Code of Practice, which you've already seen an initial draft of. That is not top of our agenda at the moment, because we think from the feedback we got from you in the first consultation, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, we think we understand what the right way to go forward with that is. So there will be further consultations on that, but that will happen through the summer, and it's not, we've got somebody working on it, but it's not top priority for us to get that out at the moment. Meanwhile, we need to set up a national committee, and that means therefore selecting a chair and then members, and we're looking to the autumn to do that. We're looking, having laid regulations before Parliament, before summer recess, and let me clarify what that means. Because this will go forward as a statutory instrument, and it's an affirmative statutory instrument, that means that Parliament can only either accept or reject it in its entirety. That puts a big onus on us as officials to make sure we get it in a format that Parliament is going to accept and largely be happy with. Of course, nobody's going to be happy with all of it. Everybody's going to end up a little bit unhappy, actually, I'm sure. But if that happens, we've probably got it right. But what it does mean is that we don't want it to get kicked out by one or other house. But the debates in the houses will be based on what we publish, and that is the only piece of legislation, the only statutory instrument that they will be able to pass. So that means through the summer, you'll all be able to see what the regulations say. You'll have the certainty of knowing what the regulations ultimately are going to be, on the assumption it doesn't get kicked out. And that will give you a lot of certainty, and it also calms down some of the other debate that may be taking place over the summer. And bear in mind there are also some bits that are peripheral to this that we need to get on with. Section 24, which is the confidentiality clause as it's often called, we know that we need to review that. We understand that our current legislation actually does meet all the transparency objectives of the directive already, but we have made commitments, or ministers have made commitments before Parliament in the past. So we do need to do that, but our plan at the moment, our thinking at the moment, is to try and do that separately, probably in the first half of 2013. Likewise, we need to talk to the Ministry of Justice about penalties, and we need to think those through carefully, what sort of penalties are going to be effective and so on. And we need to publish the guidance and the code of practice. So quite a lot of things still to be done. One thing which we've said a number of times is we're using a policy, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we know that the current system of licenses and certificates works well. Why start with a clean sheet of paper and try and redo it and think of a better way? It works well. So largely what you wake up to on the 1st of January will feel quite significantly like what it feels like at the moment. Some of the terminology may change, and we'll try and help you through the guidance to understand that change, and that's legally inevitable because of the wording in the directive. But we have no plans for significant change in approach. And as Clive alluded to, I think other member states are going to find things are very much more different on January the 1st than compared with yourselves here in the UK. Having said that, there will be some changes, and it's important that we take the time and we help you to understand what those are. So one of the things that we needed to work with you all on was Annex 3 and the Code of Practice. So we currently have two codes of practice, a user and a breeder code of practice. We're now confronted with Annex 3 to the directive, and we needed to work out how we were going to bring those together into the new world as such. We published consultation on some drafts, chapters really of the Code of Practice in December, and asked for your responses by January. A very good response, very helpful, very informative, over 60 responses. And there was the underlying theme from the majority of responders was concern about the status of the code and not really having clarity over which bits were mandatory and which bits were advisory guidance and so on. So, and several of you in the audience here I know have already heard me say this, but let me, just for those of you who aren't aware of this, fill in for you how we're proposing to address this, because it was really helpful getting that feedback, because it made us realise we need to be very clear about what is mandatory, because Annex 3 actually brings in mandatory standards. And therefore we need to make sure you're aware of what those mandatory standards are, because they will be mandatory. So we need to make sure that's clear. We also, against that backdrop, have the European Commission's, the EU Commission's recommendation of 2007, which is basically ETS 123, Appendix A, with a few changes. It's not quite ETS 123, but it more or less, as I've said here, incorporates ETS 123. So in a sense, what the Commission did was to pluck out of their recommendation 2007-526EC, they plucked out of that the things that their lawyers told them they could make mandatory and that they decided they wanted to make mandatory. And after quite a bit of battling and so on in Brussels, which many of you advised us on and helped us with in terms of having those battles, we ended up with the Annex 3 that we've got. So Annex 3 is the mandatory part. The rest of the Commission's recommendation still sits there, of course, as the backdrop for the directive and is referred to in the recitals, if you've taken time to read the recitals at the beginning. And then there's a further part of this that we believe is important, because here in the UK, people want to do things the right way and want to have advice on how they might be able to move towards best practices and improved practices and so on. And we can look at a lot of things that have moved in the UK in terms of standards that have very much been driven by practitioners on the ground who've spread good words amongst themselves at meetings like this, shared best practice, and things have happened and improved as a consequence of that. So we want to not lose that good stuff, and using this as a means of communicating some of that, some of it coming into, as it emerges into the literature and so on. So we're looking to have a part of the guidance, which will be the code of practice, which will be very clearly guidance. So the second and third parts of this are guidance, and the third part will be differentiated from the Commission recommendation by putting it into, with planning at the moment, into italics. And that's very much emerging concepts. It's advice that is good advice to somebody who might be just starting up or whatever, or some new information that might be emerging in the literature. I mean, an example is there's some very interesting literature being developed at the moment around temperatures for housing mice, and showing that different strains of mice, not surprisingly, actually prefer different temperatures, and recommending actually at the end of the day, perhaps the most important thing is to give the mouse the tools to be able to manage its own environmental temperature through bedding materials and enrichment and so on like that. Now that's not something that belongs in the mandatory part, and it's not in the European Commission's recommendation, but it is quite useful information with backup references that can be quoted to help people think about that and think, that sounds like a useful piece of information. Another example I give is there are some good references about the importance of socialization of young animals, particularly dogs and cats, and therefore to emphasize how important that is in those early weeks of development is something that could belong in the italics part of this, so that somebody kind of getting into that area could actually look at that as being something that is advice for them to think about. But it will be very clearly not mandatory, and inspectors will know that it's not mandatory stuff, it's just good advice. Okay. What this allows us to do, therefore, is evolve the code as new scientific evidence emerges, in that the mandatory and EU guidance can only be changed in discussion with other member states. But the UK guidance can be reviewed and updated in consultation with people like yourselves, and it will be clearly not mandatory. And when we come to having EU steps for updating, we'll be in a good position in the UK to be able to submit evidence of material that we might think might go into a future update, but that will be way on into the future. Okay, let's come on to some of the other things that you're going to be talking a little bit more about today. Ethical review processes and animal welfare bodies. So aims and functions of the ERP are in Appendix J of our current guidance, and they do broadly translate to the animal welfare body tasks that are in Article 27 of the directive. And I've just sort of captured some words here for Appendix J in terms of aims and so on. We've got independent ethical advice, support named people and licensees, promote ethical analysis, and promoting the 3 R's. So these are all things we've got in there. And I should say, just bear in mind, the word ethical is absent from the directive for a reason which was battled by certain member states who had a philosophical objection to having ethical in a directive text. So rightly or wrongly it was taken out. That doesn't mean that we can't have it in our legislation if we choose to, but nevertheless the Commission is clear in its wish that there should be ethical evaluation taking place and there should be ethical thinking that's ongoing. So if we then look at what's in Article 27, we find very similar terminology in terms of advise staff on welfare, care and use, promoting application of the 3 R's, following development of projects and advising on the 3 R's, and this additional one on advising on rehoming, of course. So we can map those side by side, and you'll remember that we did an exercise on that as part of the public consultation last year, and I think others have continued that mapping so that we can see where are the differences. So I'll come back to the differences in a moment, because the key difference that's always that is obvious is that function 2 in Appendix J does not translate directly across into Article 27. But I'd like to come back and talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Let me just deal also with membership a little bit first as well. So again, there's a lot of distress expressed about membership of animal welfare bodies and concern that that doesn't match with ethical review processes at the moment. So again, looking at Appendix J in Article 27, there is not the great difference that you might superficially perceive. So let's look at that. In ASPA, Appendix J, we talk about as many as possible people being involved in the ethical review process. Whereas the directive talks in terms of it must include at least. So that's a slightly different approach. We actually, at the moment, don't mandate any particular roles in the ethical review process, whereas the directive does, but it's mandating a minimum, so it's include at least. If we go on down then, and I've shorthanded these, at the moment we say the NVS should be involved. We don't say what that means. We say the NVS should be involved in the ethical review process. Compare that with, in the directive, the animal welfare body shall receive input from the NVS. It's not a million miles apart. We might have wanted it to say, and we might have pressed for it to say that the NVS would be a member of it. Other member states didn't want to go that way, but we're not a million miles away from each other there, I think. In ours, we say the NACWO, or it's not that terminology, but effectively the NACWO should be involved in the ERP. Versus in the directive, it says that there should be representation from those who are responsible for the care and welfare of the animals, and it shall include at least that representation. So there is actually an obligation to have those people on the animal welfare body. And likewise, scientists, we say they should also be represented. The animal welfare body says where it's a scientific procedure establishment, where it's a user establishment, shall include at least those people. So actually, in reality, there is a lot of mandate here. What it doesn't do is to say firmly what the other people on the animal welfare body should be. So you have to bear in mind that the minimum membership need not be the only membership. And what I think would be really exciting to hear from you today would be bearing in mind that at the moment we have ERPs in place and they seem to work pretty well. How can we assure sufficient membership? If we start building it into the Act, what's going to happen is we're going to end up gold plating animal welfare bodies in small little establishments where they don't need to be so complex. So that's the danger of starting to try to add further mandatory roles in the animal welfare body. On the other hand, the danger of not doing that is, will you find it's really hard to maintain the membership that works at the moment? And I think you have to ask yourself the question then, well, how did we get that membership in the first place? And if it works well, what would try to change it? And how can we assure sufficient membership? So I think that would be really a helpful thing. Let's look at function 2 briefly as well then. So in shorthand again, it's about examining applications for new project licenses and amendments, likely cost to animals, expected benefits, and doing the balance on that. Now, the difficulty we've always had with that, not always, I guess when we put it in there in the first place we didn't see a difficulty, but more recently is that wording seems to mimic what the inspector does in terms of reviewing your applications and advising the Secretary of State. So we've got ourselves in a bit of a trap here because we're on the one hand saying ERPs must do this, or it's one of their functions, but we're also saying inspectors should do it. And we end up with applicants saying, I have to go through the same hoop twice. I have to go through that hoop with my ERP, and then I have to go through the hoop with the inspector. And it's very wasteful. And I don't think anybody benefits from that. But having said that, it is important that we are picking up what's good out of this and what's beneficial. So let's look at what the Commission said. The Commission is clear that project evaluation is, firstly, it's the responsibility of the competent authority. So in the UK, that's the Home Office. It should consist of a harm-benefit analysis. It must be impartial and it must be independent. and it must involve a process which is transparent. Okay? So those are quite key fundamentals to project evaluation that we have to deliver in how we implement legislation to evidence to the Commission that we have implemented it effectively. So that means, therefore, there's a piece of work there that has to be done by the competent authority. In order to be, sorry, I was just reading my point there to make sure I was moving this on. Having said that, in order for the animal welfare body to be able to do its tasks, which involve advising on development and outcome of projects, clearly they need to be engaged at the application stage. So you can't sort of say, well, we're not going to involve you at all, but here, by the way, is a project which is already approved and it's going to go ahead, and we want you to advise on the development and outcome of it and be a part of the process going on, and maybe even retrospective assessment at the end. So it's clear that there has to be some sort of engagement. How can we make that engagement so that it's not a duplication? And I wonder whether part of the problem is this text we have there about examining applications for new project licenses and amendments. Maybe what we should say is actually the ERP should be advising on work which it is proposed to be doing at the establishment. That takes it away from the application and sitting down with the application as such, and more about what is this proposed work? How is it going to be done? Have we got the facilities? Have we got the trained staff? Do we want to do it here? Is it the kind of work we want to be associated with? And those sort of local level questions that inspectors will not be asking, but actually need to be asked at that point when the project is being put together. So it's not taking the ERPs, or end up calling them, away from that early stage. Clearly, to do the middle and end stage, you've got to be in at the beginning, and you have to have the cycle working of feedback from what's ongoing in projects, what's assessed at the end of projects, feeding back into the beginning of projects. We need to make sure that's happening, but we need to make sure it's happening in a way that's not bureaucratic and works well. I was just going to say only a few things about communication, because there's many people in this room who are much more expert on this, and I think they're all doing the communication working group today, so hopefully you get some good stuff out of that. It is important. Good communication supports public confidence, which is important for all of us. Just to remind you, there is no legal barrier to showing procedures to public and media, provided that the work is licensed and it is being done for a scientific purpose. That is, it's not just a demonstration piece, okay? So we have no objection to you doing that. There is no legal barrier. Sometimes I hear people saying we can't do that because the Home Office won't allow us to. That isn't the case, but you do need to be sure that it is actually a real procedure being carried out under a real license for a scientific purpose. Bear in mind also, and I think most of us know this, most effective communication is when it's well planned in advance and it's proactive. In other words, you are going forward and offering your communication to the community that's receiving it. Reactive communications tend to sound defensive. So when you're in a hole, your communication is going to sound defensive, come what may. Even with all the expertise that's in this room, it is going to tend to sound defensive unless it's part of a proactive plan. So if you already have in place a proactive plan and something happens that you need to react to, it's much easier to do that in a credible way as part of that proactive plan, as opposed to suddenly jumping up out of your burrow and saying, we want to talk to you now. So, I mean, this is all bread and butter stuff, and I'm sure you all know it. It's just that I know it's also a struggle for people like Fiona Fox at the Science Media Centre to get people to agree to communicate. So it needs to be kind of taken through into some activity as well. It's not a Home Office role. Okay. On the humane killing side, our proposal, as you know, is to revise current Schedule 1. And we published a consultation in mid-March. I apologise we didn't give you long to respond on it, but we did get 39 responses by mid-April, which was the deadline. We allowed, I think, 2 or 3 to go over deadline, but we got some very helpful responses. We have to move on this because this schedule has to be part of the regulations, so we have to get it finalised. Broadly, your responses were very supportive, and that came from all sides of the spectrum, if I can put it that way. The sort of key messages that we got was that you support the general shape of a revised Schedule 1. So that's good news, we're on the right track with it. You want guidance on implementation. And again, that's fine, we will put something in our guidance about Schedule 1 and its implementation. And the sort of things you've identified, which is very helpful to us, is understanding a little bit more about the decision-making with regard to whether sedation or anaesthesia should take place prior to killing. And there were questions asked about, well, will we have to get the Home Office's permission for that, or can we make those decisions locally and things like that? So we clearly need to clarify that, and we do obviously want to try and make this as unbureaucratic as possible. Some guidance on fish and cephalopods in terms of methods of killing and recognising death and so on, and confirming death. We've had quite a lot of feedback on the problem that we knew about when we published our proposals, and we do have a method of addressing. It's the breeding colonies of rodents and the numbers of neonates that need to be humanely killed and the methods that are used at the moment. And there's a lot of discussion around CO2 killing, particularly CO2 killing of neonates. I won't go into all the details at the moment, but suffice it to say that we believe we have the solution to that by using the exemptions that are allowed in the directive and applying them on certificates of destination, or whatever those are called at the end of the day. So it is clear, in an environment where you have large numbers of neonatal rodents that need to be killed because they're the wrong gender or whatever, that they do need to be killed humanely, obviously. If we require breeding colonies to do that, commercial breeding colonies particularly, by neck dislocation or something of that nature, then there clearly are risks in terms of what that does to people who are doing that as their day-to-day job. And also, there is a problem of it being incorrectly done. And so we believe that we have a good case to be able to justify using CO2 in that environment. The problem actually comes more, because there is evidence now coming out that actually neonatal rodents do not feel pain or distress as part of CO2, it just takes a long time. The problem is more the method of confirming death, which we have to do under the directive, but if we wait until rigor mortis sets in, there is a possibility that some of those neonatal rodents might recover and regain consciousness. And is that more humane? I don't think it is, arguably, than actually what is current practice, which is to take the lengthily exposed to CO2 neonatal rodents and to freeze them immediately. So we're looking at that, and we think we've got the answers. So methods of confirming death, also you wanted some advice on that. Some requests that argon should be allowed as an inert gas for pigs, and some questions around cervical dislocation and decapitation, and wishes that decapitation should be included, but I'm not sure if we'll be able to do that. Turning then to education, training and competence, we did some work prior to the expert working group in March on this, and that group was attended on our behalf by Fraser Darling, who is here today and leading the working group, so that will be good continuum for you. We came up with a document which we discussed around the various interested bodies here in the UK, so that we could put that forward to the Commission as part of what they call their thought starter. So when an expert working group is going to meet, in order for there to be a working document as the starter for it, they ask member states to submit evidence, documents and so on that might contribute to the thought starter. And we decided that rather than deluging them with lots of stuff about what we do on training and so on, we would actually put together a guiding principles document. And we would involve the accreditors and the trainers and others, including ourselves in the Home Office, in pulling together that document. My initial ambition was that it was going to be 2 pages of bullet points. It ended up as 9 pages, but that's still pretty brief compared with what it could have been. And the sort of guiding principles we came up with, clearly a training system must promote free movement across Europe. That's a major aim of the Commission, and I think that needs to be our aim as well. Training must be relevant to the needs of the trainee. We need to try as far as we can to ensure that what trainees are asked to undergo actually has relevance to what they are going to be doing. The quality of the training needs to be assured, so there needs to be some system of assuring that quality. And of course, the directive brings in the idea of keeping up to date, and a system that promotes keeping up to date is desirable. Just to remind you, there are 4 categories in Article 23.2 to be trained: those who are carrying out procedures on animals, those who are designing procedures and projects, which is rather similar to our project license holders, those who are taking care of animals, and those who are merely killing animals. So those are the 4 categories. Who gets involved in this? Under Article 24, we have requirements of personnel. So we have to involve those who are responsible for overseeing welfare and care, which is similar to the NAQO role at present. New role, the individuals who have to ensure staff have access to information specific to the species. So that's quite interesting. Could be the librarian in terms of making sure that there is access to information on the species, or you could interpret it in other ways. And this very important new role of the person responsible, or persons responsible for ensuring staff are adequately educated, competent, and I've underlined that there because I think that's the most important word, continuously trained. I mentioned earlier that this brings in this context of continuous training, and supervised till demonstrated competence. So that what one might call training and competence officer in broad terms. A new role, and a very important role, in how the directive is going to deliver assurance of competence at designated places. In addition, we have the designated veterinarian who can be involved in training. They're expected to have expertise in laboratory animal medicine, provide advice on well-being and treatment of animals. There is an alternative, it can be a non-veterinarian where more appropriate. So the default would be to have a veterinarian in this role. And then in Article 26, let's not forget the animal welfare body, who have, as I've already said, tasks similar to the current ERP. They're providing key advice on welfare and implementation, promotion of the 3 Rs. So training is very relevant to the delivery of their tasks. And I think that's another level at which we can see training and oversight of training being delivered within establishments. So progress we've made so far, the expert working group took place in, it was February, wasn't it? I was thinking it was March, but it's longer ago than I thought. Fraser Darling attended on our behalf. There were also a number of other UK representatives from accrediting bodies, FALASA, EFAT, RSPCA. We submitted our thought starter beforehand, detailing the guiding principles that I summarised earlier. The sort of things we were saying was we wanted the training provision to focus on outcomes rather than process. So the process of delivering training was less important than the outcome, and I think we all agree with that. We want to seek EU harmonisation, and we want to have flexibility in the range of delivery methods. Not all subjects need to be delivered in the same way. Not all member states will have the ability to deliver in the same way. The more flexibility there is, the more people will be able to pick the most relevant type of delivery and content that is appropriate for them. And that brings me to the next one. Tailor the training to the individual needs as far as possible. Make the training relevant. So that implies a kind of minimal essential core. The essential core might be you need to understand the regulations that you're working under, and you need to understand the ethics and ethical thinking that surrounds the use of animals in research. And it could be that everything beyond that becomes prerequisite of some sort, because the prerequisites are what you in addition need to know in order to be able to do the things you propose to do under your licenses, under this regulation. We thought about quality control, and I talked about that, referred to that earlier. Clearly, at the moment, we have a very robust system of accreditation, but is that the only system that we need to have? Because it does inevitably, because of its robustness, it tends to be a bit heavy-handed, and that does therefore mean that it loses flexibility, and it drives fewer courses to be available. So is there an alternative, a lighter weight approval or recognition process that can achieve the appropriate quality for particular courses? Because we often struggle to find an accredited course in a particular area where somebody needs some quality training. So there's some thinking around that which would be useful to get out of your discussion today, I think. Supervision is really important, and one of the things that we see as we move the responsibility and accountability for competence down to the places very much, that is part of the driver that will be able to assure places that they are monitoring competence effectively. And one of the other things that we're quite keen on is that there should be some sort of open source method of getting feedback on courses and giving people access to information about courses. If I go to a restaurant, I get an email the next day asking me to give feedback on the meal. And I go to restaurants that get good feedback. So why shouldn't people go to courses that get good feedback? And it would be a very good way of actually driving quality of courses. Let market forces play a role, I'm not saying the only role, but play a role in determining the quality of courses. Okay, finally then, I just want to cover a little bit on risk-based inspection, because we have been doing this, and I'm going to whiz through this bit, I think, actually. The risk that we're looking at is risk of non-compliance, and we've developed a list of objective factors that we consider, which I've listed here, in terms of numbers of licenses and how severe they are and so on like that. In addition to that, we look at other factors, and these are things that are of interest to you, I think, today, in that we're looking at things like the effectiveness of the ERP. How influential are the named persons? Do they get listened to? Is there a good training, supervision and competence system in place? Are the facilities maintained voluntarily, or does the inspector have to keep banging on the drum to get the light bulb changed or whatever? So it's that kind of thing that gets into this risk-based assessment. Those factors get rolled into our formula, provides a score, sounds terribly formulaic and mathematical. There's always that judgment as well that gets added to it. But resources then are allocated in relation to risk. And they become the core of that, the substance of that assessment becomes a really fruitful basis for a risk management meeting, which is held at least annually by the inspector with the PCD holder, and often the named persons come into that meeting. And it gives a really good structure to the meeting, because you're talking about what are the things that you might be able to improve that will actually help to mitigate your risk. So it informs judgment and it informs our risk trend over time. So, why does risk-based inspection matter in relation to what we're talking about today? Well, what it means is that we can focus our resources where it can be most effective, because we're actually triaging places and understanding what their risk is, and understanding therefore what it is that we can both help places with and inspect places against. We can incentivize and reward good behaviour. So we can look at ways in which we can either reduce frequency of inspection. I know you all say you like to see your inspector, but sometimes the reduction in frequency for having alternative access to inspectors, if you're just seeking advice, might be welcome. So we can look at ways of incentivising and rewarding good behaviour in places where there is a really sound, solid system in place. And we can focus attention at the places on the measures that are needed to mitigate risk. So we can make sure that that's the focus that they're putting there. Now, bringing you back to these UK government principles then, what I said earlier is, in this complex environment of science, the more simple we can make our regulatory process whilst retaining effectiveness, the better. And by approaching it in this way, we can actually help to make sure that establishments can take responsibility, and we know where they are effectively taking that responsibility for what goes on within the establishment. We know that the vast majority of people are willingly compliant, they want to comply, so we have a compliant community, and we want to be able to make use of that in order to maintain a relatively simple regulatory system. the kind of complexity that gets wrapped into it is if every time one place does something wrong, every place has to have an extra bit of regulation strapped on to avoid anybody else possibly doing it again. And we don't want to get down that route. We want to try and, through putting responsibility and accountability into places and understanding where the risks are and which places are more risky than others, we want to be able to incentivise and reward that good behaviour where responsibility is taken. And what that brings me to then is this balance of what we're looking at. Because actually what we're trying to encourage is a relatively lightweight environment where it can be to inform and enable science to go ahead without too excessive regulatory burden, but at the same time to be conscious and confident that animal welfare is being appropriately safeguarded. And through that, to deliver the confidence of the public. And that's what the regulatory system is about. So the public likewise wants to be confident that they are going to get scientific benefits or benefits from science, new cures for diseases and so on. But they want to also know that that's not being done at the expense of unnecessary pain in terms of animals.